The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the rain. Rachel Turner gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps that fogged the glass. The highway stretched endlessly before her, blurred by water and tears she hadn't realized were falling. Her phone buzzed again in the cup holder. Daniel's name lit up the screen. She didn't reach for it. She couldn't, not after what she'd just seen. It took 3 years for me to discover that my husband had another family, and it only took a car accident for the truth to come crashing down. That sentence played on a loop in her mind as she drove through the storm, each word a fresh wound. 3 years. 1,095 days of waking up next to a man who kissed her forehead every morning before leaving for work, who brought home Chinese takeout on Fridays, who held her hand during Sunday morning walks through their neighborhood in Bellingham, Washington, who promised her, over and over, that Portland was just a city where his company needed him twice a month. Just business. Just meetings. Just temporary. She'd believed him because believing was easier than doubting, because their life together looked exactly like what she'd always wanted. The 2-story house with the blue shutters, the garden she'd planted with tulips and lavender, the spare bedroom they'd painted pale yellow, waiting for a baby that Daniel said would come when the time was right. Rachel had been patient. She'd been trusting. She'd been a fool. The memory of that afternoon flickered behind her eyes like a damaged film reel. She'd been at her desk at Morrison & Associates, filing invoices and answering phones, when her cell rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. This is Swedish Medical Center in Seattle. Is this Rachel Turner? Your husband, Daniel Turner, was in a car accident. You need to come immediately. Her heart had stopped. Then it started again, hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She'd grabbed her purse, told her boss there was an emergency, and driven 90 miles in 70 minutes, praying the entire way, praying he was alive, praying it wasn't serious, praying that God would let her have just one more chance to tell him she loved him. She never imagined she'd walk into that hospital and find another woman sitting beside his bed, holding his hand like it belonged to her. If you've ever felt like something was wrong but couldn't prove it, subscribe now, because this story will show you that the truth always finds a way to surface. Rachel pulled into a rest stop off Interstate 5, her hands still shaking. She turned off the ignition and sat in the silence, broken only by the drumming rain on the roof. Inside her purse was the hospital wristband they'd tried to give her, the clipboard with forms she'd refused to sign, and a photograph she'd taken with trembling fingers from the bulletin board in Daniel's hospital room while the nurse was explaining his condition. A photograph of him smiling, arms around a woman with auburn hair, and a little girl who had his eyes. They were standing in front of a Christmas tree. The little girl was holding a sign that read, "Santa loves our family." Rachel looked down at her left hand. Her wedding ring caught the gray light filtering through the clouds. White gold. Simple. Elegant. He'd slipped it onto her finger 6 years ago in a garden ceremony surrounded by people who'd cried happy tears. Her mother had called it the most beautiful day of her life. Rachel had believed her marriage was built on love. But love doesn't lie. Love doesn't create entire alternate realities. Love doesn't look you in the eyes every single morning and pretend you're the only one. She pulled the ring off slowly, feeling the slight resistance as it passed over her knuckle, and dropped it into the cup holder. It clinked against loose change. Such a small sound for something that had meant everything. For 6 years, Rachel had lived inside a routine so predictable it felt like safety. Daniel worked as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, a job that required travel, but nothing excessive. Twice a month, like clockwork, he'd pack his navy blue suitcase, kiss her goodbye on Thursday morning, and return Saturday afternoon smelling like hotel soap and exhaustion. He'd collapse on the couch, ask about her week, and fall asleep during whatever movie she'd picked. It felt normal. It felt like marriage. Their house sat on Maple Street, a quiet road where neighbors knew each other's names and borrowed lawnmowers without asking. Rachel loved that house. She'd spent weekends painting the kitchen a soft cream color, hanging curtains she'd sewn herself, arranging furniture until every room felt like it belonged in a magazine. The master bedroom had photographs on the wall, their wedding day, a trip to the Oregon coast, Daniel laughing at her 30th birthday party, evidence of a life she thought they were building together. She worked at Morrison & Associates, a small accounting firm where she answered phones, organized files, and occasionally helped with data entry. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Her coworkers were kind. Her boss, Martin, let her leave early when she had dentist appointments. She brought homemade cookies to the office every Christmas. On her desk sat a framed photo of her and Daniel from their honeymoon in Cannon Beach, both of them windswept and grinning, the ocean stretching behind them like a promise. But there were signs. Small ones. The kind you dismiss because acknowledging them means admitting something might be wrong. There were the phone calls Daniel would take outside, standing on the back porch even in the rain, his voice low and careful. When she asked who it was, he'd say a coworker, a client, someone boring. There was the perfume she noticed once on his collar, floral and unfamiliar. He'd laughed it off, probably from someone at the conference. You know how crowded those elevators get. There were the nights he'd come home and barely touch her, exhausted in a way that felt distant rather than tired. And there were the dates he'd forget. Her birthday 2 years ago when he'd apologized profusely and promised to make it up to her. Their anniversary last year when he'd been in Portland and sent flowers instead of coming home. Small disappointments that she'd swallowed down because complaining felt ungrateful. He was working hard. He was providing. He loved her. She told herself that over and over until she believed it. Rachel had wanted children desperately. She'd brought it up carefully, nervously, during dinners and lazy Sunday mornings. Daniel always smiled and said soon. Soon, when work calms down. Soon, when we've saved a little more. Soon, when the timing is right. She'd painted the spare bedroom anyway, imagining a crib beneath the window, a mobile hanging from the ceiling, tiny clothes folded in the dresser. She'd bought a book about pregnancy and hidden it in her nightstand. She'd dreamed in colors she couldn't name yet, but there was something else, something she couldn't articulate even to herself, a hollow feeling that crept in during the quiet moments. When Daniel kissed her, it was gentle, but his eyes seemed to look past her. When he held her hand, his grip felt polite rather than desperate. When he said, "I love you," it sounded like a line he'd memorized rather than a truth he couldn't contain. She'd pushed it down. Told herself she was being paranoid. Told herself that marriage wasn't supposed to feel like a romance novel forever. Told herself that stability was enough, that comfort was enough, that she was enough. She'd been wrong about all of it. It was a Friday night in late October when everything Rachel thought she knew disintegrated like ash in the wind. Daniel had left the house at 6:30, dressed in the charcoal suit she'd picked out for him last Christmas, his cologne lingering in the hallway long after the door clicked shut. He'd kissed her cheek quickly, distracted, already halfway out the door, before she could ask what time he'd be home. "Business dinner," he'd said. "Potential client from Seattle. Could be late." She'd nodded, smiled, told him good luck. Then she'd heated up leftover pasta and watched television alone, the way she did every time he had these evening meetings that seemed to multiply with each passing month. At 8:47, her phone rang. The sound cut through the silence of the house like a scream. She grabbed it from the coffee table, expecting Daniel's name on the screen, maybe calling to say he'd be even later than expected. Instead, she saw unknown number glowing in the darkness. Her thumb hovered over the decline button. Telemarketers. Spam. Nothing important. But something made her answer. Some instinct she'd later wish she'd ignored. "Is this Rachel Turner?" The voice was female. Professional. Measured in that particular way. Medical staff are trained to deliver bad news without causing immediate panic. "Yes. This is Rachel." Her heart was already beginning to accelerate, her body responding to danger before her mind could process it. "This is Swedish Medical Center in Seattle. Your husband, Daniel Turner, was involved in a motor vehicle accident approximately 1 hour ago. He's stable, but we need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible." The words didn't make sense at first. They hung in the air like foreign objects, refusing to arrange themselves into meaning. Daniel was at a business dinner. Daniel was fine. Daniel was in Bellingham, not Seattle. Seattle was 90 miles away. Why would Daniel be in Seattle? "I don't understand," Rachel heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and thin. "Are you sure you have the right person? My husband is at a dinner meeting here in town." There was a pause. The nurse's voice softened, became more careful. "Ma'am, we have Daniel Michael Turner. Date of birth, March 15th, 1987. Washington driver's license." "Is that your husband?" Rachel's throat closed. Those were his details. Exactly right. "Yes," she whispered. Then I need you to come to Swedish Medical Center as quickly and safely as possible. Do you need the address? Rachel didn't remember grabbing her purse or her keys, didn't remember locking the door or starting the car. The next thing she knew with any clarity, she was on Interstate 5 heading south, her hands locked on the steering wheel, her mind spinning through 1,000 terrible possibilities. Car accident. How bad? Was he bleeding? Were bones broken? Would he be okay? Why was he in Seattle? The business dinner. He must have driven down for the dinner. He hadn't mentioned it was in Seattle, but maybe he'd told her and she'd forgotten. Maybe she hadn't been paying attention. Guilt mixed with terror in her chest until she couldn't breathe properly. She made the 90-mile drive in 72 minutes, breaking every speed limit, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Please let him be okay. Please let him live. Please don't take him from me. I'll be better. I'll be more patient. I'll stop asking about children. Just let him be alive. Swedish Medical Center rose out of the Seattle darkness like a monument, all lit windows and sterile white walls. Rachel abandoned her car in the emergency parking lot and ran through the automatic doors, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fluorescent lights were blinding after the darkness outside. The smell of disinfectant and floor wax made her nauseous. Daniel Turner, she told the woman at the reception desk, her voice breaking. My husband. He was in a car accident. The woman typed something into her computer, her face neutral and practiced. 3rd floor, room 317. Take the elevators on your left. Rachel ran to the elevators, jabbed the button repeatedly as if that would make them arrive faster. Her reflection in the polished metal doors showed a woman she barely recognized, hair disheveled, face pale, eyes wide with animal fear. When the elevator finally opened, she stepped inside and pressed 3 so hard her finger hurt. The 3rd floor hallway stretched endlessly. Room 304, 309, 312. Her legs felt like they might give out. 315, 317. The door was partially open. She could hear voices inside, medical equipment beeping steadily. She pushed through the door, her eyes immediately finding the hospital bed, finding Daniel lying there with his eyes closed, a bandage wrapped around his head, his arm in a sling. And then she saw the woman sitting in the chair beside his bed, holding his other hand. The woman looked up when Rachel entered, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other across the sterile hospital room. She was younger than Rachel, maybe 28 or 29, with auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and eyes that were swollen and red from crying. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater, the kind you pull on in a panic when you get a phone call in the middle of the night that changes everything. Her hand was still wrapped around Daniel's, her fingers intertwined with his in a way that looked practiced, familiar, intimate. Who are you? The woman asked, her voice hoarse and confused. Rachel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Daniel, unconscious and breathing steadily, then back at the woman, then at their joined hands. Her brain was struggling to process what she was seeing, to make it fit into the reality she'd been living in just 2 hours ago. I'm his wife, Rachel finally managed, the words scraping against her throat. I'm Rachel Turner. Who are you? The woman's face went white. Her grip on Daniel's hand tightened, then released, as if she'd been burned. She stood up slowly, unsteadily, and Rachel could see she was pregnant. Not obviously so. Maybe 4 or 5 months, but enough that the curve of her belly was visible beneath the sweater. You're his what? The woman's voice cracked. That's not possible. I'm his wife. We've been married for 4 years. The room tilted. Rachel grabbed the doorframe to steady herself, her vision narrowing to a tunnel. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed impossibly loud. Somewhere down the hall, someone was paging a doctor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Everything was too bright, too sharp, too real. There must be some mistake, Rachel heard herself saying, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. We've been married for 6 years. We live in Bellingham. We have a house on Maple Street. He works in medical supply sales. The woman stared at her, and Rachel watched the recognition dawn across her face, watched her piece together the same terrible truth that was beginning to crystallize in Rachel's mind. He told me he travels for work, the woman whispered, twice a month, to Bellingham, for client meetings. The floor wasn't steady anymore. Rachel felt herself swaying, felt the room spin around her like she was caught in a current she couldn't fight. A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, oblivious to the disaster unfolding in front of her. "Mrs. Turner?" the nurse said brightly. "I have some forms for you to—" She stopped, looking between Rachel and the other woman, her professional smile faltering. "Which Mrs. Turner?" Rachel asked, and her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone cold and distant, and already beginning to shatter. The nurse glanced down at her clipboard, confused. "Claire Turner is listed as his emergency contact and spouse in our system. She came in with him from the accident site." The nurse looked at Rachel. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" Rachel couldn't answer. She was staring at the woman, Claire, seeing the way her hand had instinctively moved to her belly, protective and automatic. Seeing the gold band on her left ring finger that looked almost identical to the one Rachel had been wearing until 2 hours ago. Seeing the truth written across every detail of this woman's face. This woman who loved the same man, who shared the same lies, who'd been living in a parallel universe that had just collided with Rachel's own. "He has a daughter," Claire said suddenly, her voice barely audible. "Lily. She's 4 years old. We live in Portland. He works from home 3 weeks a month and travels 1 week for business." Tears were streaming down her face now. "He was supposed to be home tonight. We were going to carve pumpkins." Rachel felt something break inside her chest, something fundamental and irreparable. A daughter, 4 years old, the same age the child in the spare bedroom would have been if Daniel had ever actually wanted to have a baby with her. The same years Rachel had spent painting that room yellow and buying pregnancy books and believing in a future that never existed. She turned and walked out of the room. Not ran. Walked. 1 foot in front of the other. Mechanical and deliberate. Past the nurse's station where someone called after her. Past the elevators. Through the stairwell door. She descended 3 flights of stairs without feeling her legs move, without seeing the gray concrete walls, without hearing anything except the sound of her own breathing and the words echoing in her skull. 4 years. A daughter. Portland. Wife. When she finally pushed through the hospital's exit doors, the cold October air hit her face like a slap. She walked to her car, got in, locked the doors, and sat in the darkness of the parking lot. Her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't fit the key into the ignition. Through the windshield, she could see the lit windows of the hospital, could imagine Daniel lying unconscious in one of those rooms, unaware that his carefully constructed double life had just imploded. She thought about the 6 years of her marriage, the Thursday morning goodbyes, the Saturday afternoon returns, the excuses and explanations and empty promises, every kiss that meant nothing. Every "I love you" that was a lie. Every night she'd fallen asleep next to a stranger wearing her husband's face. Rachel didn't remember driving home. One moment she was sitting in the hospital parking lot, staring at nothing, and the next she was pulling into her driveway on Maple Street at 3 a.m. The house looked exactly as she'd left it hours earlier, the porch light still burning, the tulips she'd planted last spring, standing sentinel along the walkway. Everything appeared normal from the outside, as if the world hadn't just split open and revealed the rotting foundation beneath. She unlocked the front door and stepped into the silence. The house smelled like Daniel's cologne and the vanilla candle she'd lit before he left for his supposed business dinner. Evidence of their life together surrounded her on every side. His jacket hanging by the door, his coffee mug still in the sink from that morning. The book he'd been reading on the end table, a bookmark halfway through. She stood in the entryway, her purse still clutched in her hand, and felt the full weight of the truth settle onto her shoulders like stones. The laptop. Daniel's laptop was in his office upstairs, the small converted bedroom where he worked when he was home. Rachel climbed the stairs slowly, each step requiring conscious effort, and pushed open the office door. The computer sat on the desk, closed, innocent. She'd never looked through it before, never felt the need. Trust had been the foundation of their marriage, or so she'd believed. Trust and lies, apparently, were not mutually exclusive. Her hands trembled as she opened the screen and typed in his password, their wedding date. 6 digits that now felt like a cruel joke. The desktop loaded, showing a background photo of the 2 of them from their honeymoon, both smiling at the camera with the ocean behind them. She almost closed the laptop then, almost walked away, but something kept her there. Some need to understand the full scope of the betrayal, to see exactly how deep the deception went. She found the second email account first, not his work email, or the personal one she knew about, but a third account buried in his browser history, Daniel M. Turner PDX@gmail.com. PDX, Portland International Airport code. Her stomach turned as she clicked through the inbox. Messages from Claire about grocery shopping and doctor's appointments. Photos of a little girl with dark curly hair and Daniel's distinctive nose, smiling in a park, blowing out birthday candles, holding a sign that read, "First day of preschool." There were mundane conversations about whose turn it was to pick up Lily from daycare, discussions about refinancing their mortgage, plans for a family vacation to Disneyland next summer, their mortgage, their family, their life. Rachel scrolled back through the emails, watching Daniel's second existence unfold in reverse chronology. The messages went back 4 years, just as Claire had said. But there was more. Beneath the Portland email account, she found evidence of a completely separate identity. A driver's license registered to an address in Portland, bank statements for accounts she'd never known existed, credit card bills showing purchases at stores in Oregon, receipts for a 2-bedroom apartment lease, rental insurance, utilities. He'd built an entire parallel infrastructure, complete with documentation and financial records, and a social media presence she'd never suspected. She found his Facebook profile next. Not the one she was friends with, but another one under a slightly different name. Daniel M. Turner instead of Daniel Michael Turner. The profile picture showed him holding Lily, both of them laughing. The posts were everything she'd wanted in their own marriage. Photos of family dinners, check-ins at Portland parks and restaurants, status updates about Lily's achievements and Claire's pregnancy cravings, comments from friends and neighbors who knew him as a devoted husband and father, a man who coached his daughter's soccer team and hosted barbecues on summer weekends. Rachel read every post, examined every photo, traced the outline of a life that existed in the same timeline as her own, but in a completely different dimension. While she'd been painting the spare bedroom yellow and dreaming of the children they'd have someday, he'd been raising a daughter 90 miles away. While she'd been eating dinner alone on Friday nights, he'd been carving pumpkins and reading bedtime stories. While she'd been sleeping in their bed, believing she was the only Mrs. Turner, another woman had been falling asleep beside him in Portland, believing the same thing. The sun was rising by the time she finished searching through his digital footprint. Pink light filtered through the office window, illuminating the dust motes in the air. Rachel sat at Daniel's desk, surrounded by evidence of his double life, and felt something inside her go very quiet and very still. Not anger yet, not grief, something colder and more permanent. The death of the person she'd been before yesterday, the naive woman who'd trusted too easily and asked too few questions. She walked downstairs to their bedroom, stood in the doorway looking at the bed they'd shared for 6 years, and saw it differently now. Just furniture, just fabric and wood and empty promises. She opened her closet and pulled out a suitcase, the same one they'd used for their honeymoon, and began filling it with clothes. Not everything, just enough. She packed mechanically, without thinking, folding shirts and jeans with the same careful precision she always used, as if maintaining order in this small task could somehow contain the chaos expanding inside her chest. 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations and paperwork and phone calls Rachel made from the spare bedroom with the yellow walls. She'd stopped sleeping in the master bedroom after that first night, couldn't bear to lie in the bed where Daniel had held her and whispered lies against her skin. Instead, she slept on the floor of the room she'd prepared for a baby who would never exist, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled like the fabric softener she'd always used, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember how to breathe. Daniel had woken up from his concussion 4 days after the accident. She knew this only because the hospital called her number, still listed as his emergency contact in some systems. She'd hung up without responding. He'd tried calling her directly after that, dozens of times, his name appearing on her phone screen with a persistence that felt almost obscene. She never answered, never listened to the voicemails he left. What could he possibly say that would matter? What combination of words could explain away 4 years of calculated deception? The divorce papers were surprisingly simple. Rachel had hired a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in cases involving fraud and emotional distress. Patricia had looked at the evidence Rachel brought, the emails and photos and financial records, and said 3 words that somehow made everything feel more real. "You have grounds." as if grounds were what mattered, as if the law could quantify the destruction of a person's understanding of their own life. Rachel signed where Patricia indicated, her signature looking strange and unfamiliar on the documents. She put the house up for sale. Couldn't imagine living another day surrounded by the ghost of her marriage. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Susan, had walked through, pointing out all the charming details Rachel had once loved. The built-in bookshelves, the renovated kitchen, the garden she'd tended so carefully. "It'll sell quickly," Susan assured her. "Young couples love this neighborhood." Rachel had nodded and said nothing about the fact that she'd been a young couple once, that she'd loved this neighborhood, that every corner of this house now felt contaminated by lies. She gave notice at Morrison and Associates, told Martin she needed a fresh start somewhere else. He'd been kind about it, asked if everything was all right, if there was anything he could do. She'd thanked him and packed up her desk, taking the few personal items that didn't remind her of Daniel. Not the photo from Cannon Beach, not the coffee mug he'd given her last Christmas. Just her sweater and her lunch container, and a small potted succulent that had somehow survived her neglect. The town she chose was called Fairhaven, a small community 30 miles north of Bellingham, far enough that she wouldn't accidentally run into anyone who knew her as Daniel Turner's wife, but close enough that she didn't have to completely uproot herself. She found a studio apartment above a bookstore, a tiny space with slanted ceilings and a window overlooking the main street. It was nothing like the house on Maple Street. There was barely room for a bed and a small table, and the bathroom was so cramped she had to turn sideways to close the door. But it was hers. Only hers. No shared history. No ghosts. The bookstore below was called Chapter and Verse, an independent shop that smelled like old paper and coffee. Rachel had noticed a help wanted sign in the window the day she'd come to see the apartment, and on impulse, she'd gone inside and asked about it. The owner, a man probably in his early 40s with graying hair and kind eyes, had interviewed her right there among the stacks. His name was Owen Mitchell, and he'd asked her simple questions about her reading preferences and whether she knew how to work a cash register. He didn't ask why she was looking for a new job, didn't pry into her history. He just offered her the position at $15 an hour, part-time to start, and told her she could begin whenever she was ready. She started the following Monday, 3 weeks and 2 days after the night that destroyed her old life. The work was simple, almost meditative, shelving books in alphabetical order, helping customers find titles, operating the ancient cash register that required actual physical keys. Owen mostly left her alone, working in the back office or arranging displays, occasionally emerging to recommend books to browsers. The store was quiet, rarely busy, the kind of place where time moved differently. Rachel began writing in the evenings, sitting at her small table with a notebook she'd bought from the drugstore down the street. She wrote about everything: the years with Daniel, the hospital, the emails, the betrayal, page after page of words that poured out of her like poison she needed to expel from her system. She wrote about anger and humiliation and grief. She wrote about the woman she'd been, the one who'd believed in promises and happy endings. She wrote about the woman she was becoming, harder and colder and irreparably changed. But she also wrote about small moments of unexpected peace, the satisfaction of arranging books by color instead of alphabetically and seeing how beautiful they looked, the taste of the coffee from the shop next door, the sound of rain on her window at night, the fact that she could breathe a little easier each day, as if her lungs were slowly remembering their purpose. Owen Mitchell moved through the bookstore like someone who understood the language of silence. Rachel had been working at Chapter and Verse for almost 2 months before she realized he'd been widowed, and even then, she only learned it by accident. A customer had come in looking for a book on grief counseling and mentioned how sorry she was about Owen's loss, how terrible it must be to lose someone so young. Owen had simply nodded, thanked her quietly, and helped her find what she needed. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain. When the customer left, he'd returned to pricing used books in the back room as if nothing had happened. Rachel found herself watching him sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking. The way he handled books with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent, straightening spines and smoothing covers as if each one mattered. The way he made coffee in the small break room, measuring grounds with precision, waiting patiently for it to brew. The way he listened when customers talked, really listened, his full attention on them without the distraction of a phone or the urgency to move on to the next task. There was something about his presence that felt solid and undemanding, like a stone wall you could lean against without fear it would crumble. He started bringing her coffee in the mornings, not with any fanfare or explanation, just setting a cup on the counter near the register where she worked, steam rising in the cold November air. It was always exactly how she liked it, though she'd never told him her preferences. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. The first time it happened, she'd looked up at him questioningly, but he'd already moved away, disappearing into the stacks to help a customer find a book on local history. The second time, she'd said, "Thank you." He'd nodded and said nothing else. It became a routine. Every morning at 9:15, a cup of coffee would appear beside her as if by magic. She'd take that first sip and feel something inside her chest unclench slightly, some small knot of tension loosening. It was such a simple gesture, so unremarkable, but it meant more than she knew how to articulate. It meant someone saw her. Someone noticed she was there. Someone cared enough to remember how she took her coffee without making it into a declaration or expectation. Owen recommended books to her, leaving them on the counter with small sticky notes attached. "Thought you might like this one," or "This made me think of you." Never anything pushy or romantic. Just novels he genuinely believed she'd enjoy. A mystery set in the Pacific Northwest. A memoir about starting over after loss. A collection of essays about finding beauty in ordinary things. She read every single one, staying up late in her studio apartment, the words on the page becoming a kind of company in the quiet hours. They started talking during slow afternoons when the store was empty except for the 2 of them. Small conversations at first, about books and weather, and the peculiar customers who came in looking for obscure titles. Owen had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh when she'd forgotten she still knew how. He told her about the store, how he'd bought it 5 years ago, when he needed something to focus on besides grief, how books had always been his refuge, even as a child, how he believed stories could save people if they found the right one at the right time. Rachel found herself staying later than her shift required, organizing shelves that didn't need organizing, straightening displays that were already straight. Owen never commented on it, never made her feel like she was overstaying her welcome. Sometimes he'd lock the door at closing time, and they'd sit in the back room drinking tea, talking about nothing important. He never asked about her past, never pried into why she'd moved to Fairhaven or what had brought her to his bookstore. He simply accepted her presence the way he accepted everything else, with a quiet steadiness that required nothing in return. One evening in early December, when freezing rain was turning the streets to ice outside, Owen offered to drive her home. Her car had been making strange noises for a week, and she'd finally taken it to a mechanic who'd told her it needed repairs she couldn't afford yet. She'd been walking to work, bundled in layers against the cold, telling herself it was good exercise. But that night, with the rain turning to sleet and the sidewalks becoming treacherous, Owen had simply picked up his keys and said, "Come on, I'll give you a ride." His truck was old but clean, the heater blasting warm air that smelled faintly of pine. They drove through the empty streets in comfortable silence, the windshield wipers working overtime against the ice. When he pulled up in front of her building, Rachel found herself not wanting to leave the warmth of the cab, not wanting to return to her empty studio and the notebook full of words she'd been writing to exorcise her demons. "Thank you," she said, her hand on the door handle. Owen looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror. Loss, understanding, the knowledge of what it meant to have your life shattered and be forced to build something new from the wreckage. "You're doing better than you think," he said quietly. "I can tell." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back and nodded, not trusting her voice. Then she got out of the truck and ran through the sleet to her door, feeling the weight of his words settle somewhere in her chest, like a seed that might, someday, grow into something resembling hope. The first note appeared on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, tucked between the pages of a novel Rachel was shelving in the fiction section. She almost missed it. Would have missed it if the small piece of paper hadn't fluttered to the floor when she pulled the book from the cart. She picked it up, unfolded it, and read the words written in Owen's careful handwriting. "The Japanese have a word, kintsugi, for repairing broken pottery with gold. The piece becomes more beautiful for having been broken. Thought you should know." Rachel stood there in the aisle, holding the note, feeling something crack open inside her that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite relief, but existed somewhere in between. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket, where she found herself touching it throughout the day like a talisman. The notes kept appearing. Not every day, not with any predictable pattern, but often enough that she started looking for them, hidden in books she was organizing, tucked under her coffee cup, slipped into the employee handbook on the break room table. Each one contained something small and true, a quote from a poet she'd never heard of, an observation about resilience, a reminder that healing wasn't linear, that some days would be harder than others, and that was okay. Owen never mentioned the notes, never asked if she'd found them or what she thought. They simply existed as small gifts, given without expectation of acknowledgement or gratitude. He started leaving books for her too, not just recommendations, but actual gifts. A first edition of a novel she'd mentioned loving as a teenager, a collection of short stories by a writer she'd been wanting to read, a beautiful hardcover of poetry with illustrations that looked like watercolor dreams. Each book came with a bookmark, nothing more, no card or explanation, but Rachel understood what he was saying without words, that she mattered, that her preferences and interests were worth remembering, that someone was paying attention to who she actually was, not who she'd been trained to be for someone else. One afternoon in late December, Owen invited her to have dinner with him after the store closed. Not a date, he was careful to clarify, just dinner between friends at the Italian restaurant down the street. Rachel's first instinct was to say no, to retreat into the safety of her solitude. But something made her accept. Maybe it was the way he asked, casual and pressure-free. Maybe it was the fact that she'd been eating frozen meals alone in her apartment for 3 months, and the thought of actual conversation over actual food felt suddenly appealing. Maybe she was just tired of saying no to everything that might resemble connection. The restaurant was small and warm, with red checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. They sat by the window, watching the early winter darkness settle over the street. Owen ordered pasta. Rachel ordered soup. They talked about books, as they always did, but the conversation drifted into other territories. He told her about his wife, Sarah, who died in a car accident 3 years earlier, how they'd been married for 8 years, how she'd been a teacher who loved children and wanted a house full of them, how they'd been trying when she died, how the grief had been compounded by the loss of the future they'd planned. Rachel listened and understood why he'd never pressured her to talk about her own past. He knew what it was like to have your story broken in the middle, to be left holding pieces that no longer fit together. When he finished, she found herself telling him everything. Not because she owed him an explanation, but because for the first time since the hospital, she wanted someone to know. She told him about Daniel and the double life and the woman in Portland and the daughter she'd never known existed. She told him about the house she'd sold and the job she'd quit and the person she'd been before October. Owen didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He didn't tell her everything happened for a reason, or that she was better off, or that time would heal all wounds. He simply listened, his attention complete and unwavering. And when she finished, he said, "You're not the problem, Rachel. You never were." Those words hit her with unexpected force, breaking through defenses she hadn't realized she'd built. She'd spent months blaming herself, cataloging all the ways she'd been insufficient, all the reasons Daniel had needed someone else. Too boring, too trusting, too ordinary, not enough. "I kept thinking," she whispered, her voice breaking, "that if I'd been different, if I'd been more interesting or more beautiful or more something, he wouldn't have needed to create another life." Owen shook his head slowly. "That's not how betrayal works. His choices weren't about your inadequacy. They were about his character, about his capacity for deception. You could have been anyone, and he still would have done exactly what he did, because that's who he is." Rachel felt tears sliding down her face, silent and unstoppable. She didn't try to hide them or apologize for them. Owen reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and solid, and asking for nothing. Spring arrived in Fairhaven with a gentleness that felt almost apologetic, as if the world understood it needed to approach carefully. Cherry blossoms appeared on the trees lining Main Street, petals drifting through the air like snow made of light. Rachel had been working at chapter and verse for 6 months, and somewhere in that time, without her quite noticing when it happened, the weight in her chest had begun to lift. Not disappear, The pain of Daniel's betrayal would probably never fully disappear, but it had transformed into something she could carry without feeling like she was drowning. She and Owen had fallen into a rhythm that felt natural and unforced. They had dinner together twice a week, sometimes at the Italian restaurant, sometimes at the Thai place on the corner, once at Owen's house where he'd cooked pasta from scratch, and they'd eaten on his back porch while the sun set. They talked about everything and nothing, books and childhood memories and fears they'd never spoken aloud before. He told her about Sarah's laugh and the way she'd burned every meal she tried to cook. Rachel told him about her mother's death when she was 19 and how she'd married Daniel partly because she'd been desperate for someone to make her feel less alone in the world. The physical distance between them had been closing incrementally, so slowly that Rachel barely noticed until one evening in April when they were closing the bookstore together, and Owen's hand brushed against hers as they both reached for the same stack of books. The touch lasted only a second, but it sent electricity up her arm, a feeling she'd forgotten existed. She'd looked up and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something careful and hopeful and terrified all at once. "Rachel," he'd said quietly, and her name in his voice sounded like a question he didn't know how to ask. She'd stepped back instinctively, her heart hammering. "I should go," she'd whispered, and he'd nodded without argument, but the look in his eyes had stayed with her all night, keeping her awake in her studio apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what she was feeling. The letter from Daniel arrived on a Thursday in late April, forwarded from her old address to the bookstore. Rachel recognized his handwriting on the envelope immediately, that careful script she'd once found charming. Her hands shook as she held it, standing behind the counter with Owen organizing shelves in the back room. She could throw it away unopened. She could burn it. She could pretend it didn't exist. But some part of her needed to know what he could possibly have to say after 7 months of silence she'd imposed. She opened it carefully, unfolding 3 pages of his neat handwriting. The letter was everything she'd expected, and nothing she wanted. Apologies that felt hollow, because words couldn't undo actions. Explanations that were really just excuses dressed up in prettier language. He wrote about how sorry he was, how he'd never meant to hurt her, how the situation had spiraled beyond his control. He wrote about Claire and Lily, about how he'd fallen in love twice and hadn't known how to choose, about how he'd convinced himself he could maintain both lives without anyone getting hurt, about how the accident had forced his hand but maybe it was for the best, because living a lie had been destroying him. Rachel read the entire letter standing at the counter, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. The audacity of his pain, the selfishness of framing his betrayal as something that had happened to him, rather than something he'd actively chosen every single day for 4 years. He ended the letter, asking if they could talk, if there was any possibility of forgiveness, if she could understand that he'd loved her even while lying to her. She folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and walked to the trash can behind the counter. She held it there for a long moment, feeling the weight of those 3 pages, everything they represented. Then she dropped it in and heard it land on top of yesterday's coffee grounds and discarded receipt paper. The sound was final and quietly satisfying. Owen emerged from the back room carrying a box of new arrivals. He took one look at her face and set the box down. "Are you okay?" Rachel opened her mouth to say yes, to deflect and minimize the way she'd been trained to do her entire life. But standing there in the bookstore that had become a sanctuary, looking at this man who'd shown her what it meant to be seen without being consumed, she found herself saying something different. Daniel sent a letter asking for forgiveness. Her voice was steady, surprising her. He wants to talk. He thinks there's something left to salvage. Owen went very still. "What do you want?" It was such a simple question, but no one had asked her that in months. What did she want? Not what she should do, or what would be fair, or what made logical sense. What did she, Rachel Turner, actually want from her own life? "I want to stop carrying him with me," she said quietly. "I want to stop wondering if I was enough. I want to believe that I can trust someone again without waiting for the other shoe to drop." She looked at Owen directly, her heart pounding. "I want to stop being afraid." Owen crossed the space between them slowly, giving her time to move away if she needed to. But Rachel stayed exactly where she was, rooted to the floor, watching him approach. When he reached her, he didn't touch her immediately. He just stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. could smell the coffee and old books that seemed permanently woven into his clothes. "You're not the same person you were in October," he said softly. "You've been rebuilding yourself piece by piece. I've watched you do it, and the person you're becoming is remarkable, Rachel. You're strong and resilient, and you deserve someone who sees that, someone who won't make you question your worth. Someone like you." The words escaped before she could stop them. Vulnerable and terrifying. Owen's expression shifted into something raw and unguarded. "I've been afraid to hope that you might feel the same way I do. I didn't want to push. Didn't want to be another man making demands on you when you needed space to heal." "What way do you feel?" Rachel whispered, needing to hear him say it. "Like I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the day you walked into this store. Like every morning I look forward to bringing you coffee just so I have an excuse to be near you. Like I want to know everything about you and spend whatever time you'll give me proving that not all men are liars." Rachel kissed him first. She closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his, tentative and terrified and more certain than she'd been about anything in a long time. Owen responded immediately, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her closer with a desperation that matched her own. The kiss was nothing like the ones she'd shared with Daniel, perfunctory and performed. This was real. This was two broken people finding something whole in each other. Two survivors recognizing the same scars and choosing to move forward anyway. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Rachel felt tears on her cheeks and realized she was crying. But these weren't tears of grief or betrayal. These were tears of release, of letting go of the person she'd been forced to become and allowing herself to be seen as she actually was. Owen wiped her tears away gently with his thumb, his touch reverent and careful. "I'm terrified," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I'm terrified that I'll trust you, and you'll turn out to be someone else entirely, that I'll wake up one day and discover this was all another lie." "I know," Owen said simply. "I'm terrified too. Terrified that I'll lose you the way I lost Sarah, that I'll love you and the universe will take you away. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone." They stood there in the bookstore, holding each other as the spring sunlight filtered through the windows, and Rachel felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, exactly. The wounds Daniel had inflicted would always leave scars, but transformation. The broken pieces of her life were being reassembled into something different than before, something that acknowledged the cracks while refusing to be defined by them. Kintsugi, she thought, remembering Owen's note, more beautiful for having been broken. A year later, Rachel stood in a garden much smaller than the one where she'd married Daniel, wearing a simple white dress and holding a bouquet of wildflowers Owen had picked that morning. There were only 20 people present, close friends and the chosen family they'd built in Fairhaven. No elaborate ceremony, no expensive photographer, just two people who understood what it meant to lose everything and choose to begin again, standing under an arch of cherry blossoms and making promises they intended to keep. Owen's vows were simple and direct. "I promise to be exactly who I am, every single day. No secrets, no hidden lives, no lies, not even small ones. I promise to love you in the light, where you can see me clearly, and choose me anyway." Rachel's voice shook, but didn't break, as she spoke her own vows. "I promise to trust you, until you give me a reason not to. I promise to believe that love doesn't have to hurt, that commitment doesn't require martyrdom, that I deserve to be chosen first and only. I promise to keep becoming the person I was always meant to be, and to let you be part of that becoming." When they kissed as husband and wife, Rachel felt no shadow of her past, no ghost of the woman who'd stood in a different garden 6 years earlier, and believed in promises that were already broken before they were spoken. That woman was gone, transformed by betrayal and rebuilt by her own resilience. This woman, the one kissing Owen Mitchell under a spring sky, was someone new, someone who understood that the worst day of her life had ultimately led her to the first day of something better. Sometimes the truth you're avoiding is the one that will set you free. Sometimes a car accident isn't just a tragedy, but a revelation that saves you from wasting more years on a lie. Sometimes love isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing, but about finding someone who sees your broken pieces and believes they're beautiful. Rachel had lost a husband and gained herself. She'd survived betrayal and found someone worth trusting. She'd learned that happiness isn't about never being hurt, but about refusing to let the hurt define your future. And standing there in that garden, her hand in Owen's, she understood that some endings are really beginnings in disguise, and the best chapters are often written after you've burned the old book and started fresh with blank pages. If this story touched your heart, remember that every ending carries the seed of a new beginning. That pain can transform into wisdom. That betrayal, as devastating as it is, can clear the path for something authentic. Subscribe to hear more stories about survival and resilience, about people who lost everything and discovered they were strong enough to rebuild. Because the truth is simple and profound. You deserve love that doesn't require you to be anyone other than exactly who you are. And that love exists, waiting for you on the other side of whatever darkness you're walking through now.